Okay, hello ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to this Bright Blue Fringe event. I've lost count of how many Fringe events we've done, so I can't tell you the exact number. But for those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism, and our mission really is to defend and improve liberal society. We do that across 4 domains. The first is environmental policy, social policy, employment policy, and education policy. And today's debate is, can international justice be served, stopping modern war crimes? And we're doing that in partnership with International Rescue Committee. So we're very grateful to them for their support. And indeed, Laura from the IRC will be speaking on this panel. There are people who are watching on the live stream. Hello. Hopefully there's people out there, and if you want to interact with this discussion, you can do. There is the possibility of asking questions, and they will then come to me via my phone, so tell us who you are and where you're from. If that's not working, you can also ask via Twitter by using the hashtag #BrightBlue, and one of my team will pick it up and send me the questions that way. And if you're tweeting, please do use the hashtag #BrightBlue. And you can also, if you say nice things, tweet us at @WeAreBrightBlue and also rescue_UK. So it'd be good to get some of the arguments that are coming from this debate to a wider audience. And what's this debate all about? Well, the atrocities of the 90s in Rwanda and Bosnia saw the world say never again. But as evidence, particularly at the moment in Ukraine, of Russian war crimes mounts, including sexual violence, why hasn't this proved to be the case? And what can we do now to make the promise a reality? What role can Britain play? What resources and policies does it need to create and implement and work with international partners on to ensure that war criminals are stopped and the international rules-based system is adhered to? And what concrete steps, particularly around issues such as conflict-related sexual violence, can we be leading on? So we'll hear from experts, 5 minutes each, and then we'll get questions and contributions from the floor. We've got a really excellent panel. We have Alicia Kearns, who is the chair of the China Research Group and a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and running to be chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. To my near left, we have Laura Kyrke-Smith, and Laura is the executive director of the International Rescue Committee. To my near right is Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini. Have I got that right? Anderlini. And she's the founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network, where she spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership. And then on my far right, we have Maxim, who is the Associate Foreign Editor at The Times and also a Senior Programme Manager of the Europe and Eurasia Programme at the Open Society Foundation. So I might ask Alicia to go first.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. The answer in brief is that justice must be served. That can't be something we are in any way weak on, anything we question, anything we fail to deliver on. But that doesn't make it not enormously difficult. And the reason why it matters is because it is only through justice that we heal, that communities can rebuild, that we can deter and prevent future atrocities, and also that we punish and empower those who need to rebuild their communities and set a new future. So in terms of why I think this should be a priority for the UK, even though it's incredibly difficult, is that this is actually some of our expertise. When we go around the world, whether it's working in Iraq or Somalia, previously in Yemen, different places in the world, we are experts at training on how to have scrutiny and justice and accountability. We have done it in all sorts of places in the world, from Syria, Bosnia, and I will touch on some of those. We have the ability to do it, and very few other countries are truly stepping in to do it, and I think it is something that we should be proud of. The other reason is that, like so many multilaterals, the international justice system is under attack, and no one has stood up and defended it for the last 2 decades, and that is a fundamental problem, somewhere we can stand strong and say we will fight for international justice, because otherwise we will not have effective atrocity prevention. So in terms of how we do that, for me there are kind of 4 core areas, and the first is that atrocity prevention has to be built into our system. We do not currently do atrocity prevention well. So if you were in the Foreign Office, let's say Mongolia or somewhere relatively neutral, and there somehow starts to be an outbreak of atrocities, that desk officer responsible for Mongolia suddenly has to become an expert in how do I get the UN to pay attention to this? What sanctions do we use? What aid levers can we use? What political measures do we use to try and limit and prevent further escalation? How do we stop this? That's not fair on them, but also fundamentally it's going to fail British nationals in Mongolia, and it's going to fail the Mongolian people and potentially the countries around it. So when I first got elected, I fought for the government to set up an Atrocity Prevention Centre at the Cabinet Office. They set up a conflict centre. I won't be picky, they can rebrand it however they like. But the point was to provide a central resource of expertise that can be rolled out to support people wherever needed. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet, so it's my job to make sure they make it as effective as it can be. But atrocity prevention should be at the core of our system, and that is the vehicle to do it. But at the same time, the training we do around the world, whether it's police, whether it's justice, whether it's prisons, you name it, that is the sort of thing that we should be investing in more around the world because we are damn good at it. And I have seen that in Lebanon firsthand, and I've seen it in other countries. The second thing we need to do is invest in intelligence collection. So the democratization of information and democratization of technology has given enormous opportunities for anyone to play their role now in marking and recording atrocities. We've seen the success of Bellingcat. There are lots of other organisations like it. We know that when we have the intelligence, that is how we obviously secure convictions. Look at what Caesar did. He was the very brave photographer. So the Assad regime, and I was working on Syria at the time, and I've had the privilege of helping raise awareness of the Caesar photos. Assad was so obsessed with causing harm and killing his opponents that he hired a photographer whose job was to go and photograph every single dead body and the evidence of torture within the Syrian regime, because he wanted proof that his opponents were being murdered, that they were being cracked down on. Caesar fled Syria, and he brought with him hundreds of thousands of images of tens and thousands of people, and he gave them to the West, and we were able to release them and publicise them. As a result of those images, there are now prosecutions that have taken place in Germany in third-party countries, which is something I will come to in a little bit. And this is absolutely vital that we help get that sort of information. It's also helpful that where there isn't evidence, we help collect evidence of the missing. So in Bosnia, there is an incredibly important and heartbreaking initiative to record all those who are still missing, because as we know, after they were murdered, their bodies were put in a grave. That grave was then dug up, and half their body parts and their bones moved to another, and then another and another, in an effort to hide the fact that a genocide had taken place. We can help people by collecting the evidence or recording missing sort of initiatives where we record what's happened. The next thing we need to do is to train and equip people. We can smuggle them out of war zones, and we can train them on how to collect evidence of atrocities. We can teach them how to record them properly so they meet the standards needed for international prosecutions, and we can smuggle them back into countries. We've smuggled out other people to teach them other things in far more complex environments, the most complex environments you can imagine. We should be doing so with justice because it matters that much. The final two things we need to do is first is give teeth to the system, because again, because we've been not fighting for it, we've allowed it to become weakened. We aren't funding the ICC. The fact that Bosnia has had to fight time and time again to get the money they need for the prosecutions they have. The problem is that at the end of a conflict, the heat of it and the passion that people feel for seeing justice fades slowly but surely. And we all know that there is no statute of limitations on some of the crimes we are talking about here today, in fact, any war crime. So it is vital that we keep the pressure on, that we fund into the long term in order to get these prosecutions. I also think, and some may disagree with me, that we need to be tough when it comes to aid. We need to incentivise with our allies, recipients, that they comply with the ICC, because there are too many countries around the world who refuse to comply with the ICC, and we have to do so because it is about protecting civilians. And the final thing we have to do is recognise that there are limitations, but that's when smart workarounds come, and I'm sure there'll be some much smarter ones suggested by you guys as we come to it. But one of the things I've been fighting for is a sexual crimes tribunal. We know that sex crimes are war crimes, but the problem is when you finally go in to prosecute, to collect the evidence of sexual crimes, it's too late and it's gone. We need to set up an international organisation who, when a mass atrocities or genocide or something like that or a conflict arises, they go in and they teach people how to collect the evidence. They help collect the evidence. They also help to make sure that we have everything that we need, but they also help people to heal and deal with the shame that we see around these offences, because we do not see prosecutions, because women, men and children, and that's one of the big problems of the discussion about Ukraine at the moment, we keep talking about women being raped, there are men being raped, there are children being raped. We have to make sure we end the shame and we get the evidence collected and that is needed. We also have to, and I'm not an expert in Latin, but it's called proprio motu, essentially get the ICC to do investigations without member states asking for them. They are set up for a reason. They are there to provide international criminal justice. Let's make sure they do it. And that is how we deal with, for example, the genocide taking place in Xinjiang. Third country prosecutions, the UK can lead on that. That is something we should be proud of. We have the best legal system in the world when we stand up for it and don't undermine it. And we need to make sure that we are doing more of that. And finally, it comes down to all of us working in foreign affairs and everyone in the world to say we are not going to forget and we will fight for that justice. Because the people who we've forgotten, the Yazidis, the Kurds, at the moment we've got the Uyghur, we've got the Christians in Nigeria, we've got Ukraine, we've got Bosnians. There are conflicts going on around the world where it may be 50 years before we see justice. But if all of us say justice matters, because that's how we heal, how we recover, how societies become stable, then we can see more of it. And those are my kind of starters for 10, but I'm looking forward to being challenged and going further.
Great, thank you, Alicia. Round of applause. So the UK government, Alicia, has been praised for its response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly in how it's supporting Ukraine in its defence efforts. Do you think the UK is doing enough on this particular agenda, making sure that Russia is held to account for the crimes that are committed, or would you like to see it go further in some aspects?
I think we've done an incredible job at marshalling international community attention. We've done an incredible job at making sure, I think, apart from America, I think we've been the foremost guarantor of security across Europe. But I don't think we have been looking at justice. We haven't been looking at how do we prosecute people. We haven't been looking at how do we make sure we do the work to make sure every single colonel, that soldier who had a video clip of his wife telling him to go around and rape Ukrainian women, we should be working with them now to do that, because there is enough of Ukraine that is now stable that we can be going in and making sure those services in place, that we've got this sort of justice focus. There is more than enough evidence to prove that this is a genocide based on the legal format of it. There is more than enough evidence that this is a war of aggression. There is more than enough evidence that there are war crimes taking place. We could even argue that certain international countries who've been aiding and abetting Putin could be complicit because they have been helping him do so. We've been too focused on the big picture, the Putins, the big pictures. We actually need to start prosecuting at lower levels, because we already know the Russian people don't want to be called up. We've seen the attacks on recruitment centres, we've seen people fleeing. Now we need to hold them to account and hold them to account for justice, because the Ukrainian people need to see that for them to heal and move forward, and they deserve it, the same way as those who are victims of Daesh or anyone else deserves to see justice and to have a day in court if they want it.
Great, thank you, Alicia. We'll move now to Maxim, who I think will have a lot more to say about the situation in Ukraine.
Sure, I'll focus on that, as it's where I've been spending most of my time lately. I mean, if we are to avoid having to say never again ad nauseum, I think there are three things that we can do. The first is to make sure that justice is seen to be done. I think that's very important. But the reality is that the ICC is very slow. It takes years to prosecute. It only prosecutes a handful of cases. Britain is already leading with efforts to help Ukraine's domestic system prosecute cases, but the prosecutors completely overwhelmed. There's 36,000 cases at the moment. I think what we need to see is Britain leading in helping to set up an ad hoc tribunal for Ukrainian war crimes in Ukraine. There's just the scope of it, the scale of it is so enormous that there needs to be extra help given there. And the second thing I think that we need to look at is how do we prevent the prolongation and punish the prolongation of Putin's war in Ukraine. We have a very long list of sanctions on high-level people. There are some gaps there significantly, but they are not being adequately implemented at the moment. We lack the law enforcement resources that are needed to do that, to police those lists and to make sure sanctions are not being violated. We need to put resources in place in order to effectively police and implement those sanctions lists. And really, I mean, pragmatically, we need to look at the type of weaponry and ramping up the type and scale of weaponry that we deliver to Ukraine in order to bring this war to a close and save Ukrainian lives. I mean, Ukraine is now facing a nuclear threat. If that is to be averted in any way, Ukraine will need jets and sophisticated anti-aircraft systems in order to prevent the kind of cruise missile attacks that Putin's Russia has been terrorizing Ukrainians with. And the third thing we can do, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable thing, is to look at our own role in having built Putin's power base in Russia by laundering dirty Russian money through the UK for years and years, even though it was quite clear what he was up to at home, the nature of his regime. We have a responsibility, I think, to look at our system and think about when fighting against Putin's Russia, how we avoid repeating the same mistakes. Shouldn't go, for example, to Aliyev, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan for alternative energy supply. You're just going to another dictator who will again commit the same kind of atrocities. Look at what Aliyev is doing with Azerbaijan in Armenia now. We need to look at making transparency integral to our financial system in the UK. We need to make sure that the government knows the ultimate beneficial owner of every property purchase, of every business in the UK. These are things that are being worked on as part of Economic Crime Bill 2, but there is more that can be done. And finally, in order to oversee this area in the financial markets in the UK, we really need more teeth in the regulators and better enforcement. And again, that comes down to properly resourcing law enforcement. At the moment, that's not happening.
Great. Thank you, Maxim. Round of applause, please. Okay, I'm going to move now on to Sanam.
Thank you. I'm going to take a slightly different tack in that as we sit here today, in Afghanistan, young students at Balkh University have been locked into their dorms because they were protesting for education. We left Afghanistan a year ago, and in many ways, by excluding and stonewalling Afghan women from the Doha negotiations in the run-up to the handover to the Taliban or the takeover of the Taliban, we basically created the conditions for the most horrific forms of violence against women and girls. There is child marriage going on, forced marriage, which is basically rape. There is the lack of education and all the life opportunities that are happening. I'm Iranian by heritage. Last night at Sharif University, which is the most prominent technical university in the country, and across the country, students were being attacked. We don't know how many people have been killed, and of course you know that the protest started because of the killing of a young woman because of her hijab by the guidance police, or however they call themselves. I raise these things because if we're serious about justice and accountability for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so forth, we need to think about it as an ecosystem of support that we have. And when we think about justice solely in terms of we're going to bring people to court, you're actually not necessarily dealing with what the survivors of violence need in a holistic way. In the UK itself, at the moment, less than 1% of rape cases are prosecuted in this country, in our country. Right? So how are we going to say that we're going to go and prosecute rape crimes in wherever it is, Yemen, Syria, etc. Right? So in the absence of that, or in the effort to try and bring legal justice or criminal justice to perpetrators, we also need to think about the other aspects, which is the survivors of these horrific crimes. What kind of healthcare do they need? How do you shift the shame and shift the fear from the victim to the perpetrator or to the would-be perpetrator? These are some of the things that need to be thought of, and it's not something that we can think about here alone sitting in the Foreign Office. It's really about engagement with women and communities on the ground to try and understand that. In my work with the network, I work with a network of women-led peace-building organizations in 41 countries around the world where there's conflict and violent extremism. And we see this repeatedly. The first people to respond are women, responding to all forms of violence that are happening. When they go forward to try and understand what happened to the missing and the disappeared, what happens is that they get harassed, they get raped. So the crimes keep increasing, right? And the responses need to be local as well. In Uganda, I have colleagues who figured out how to work at the local level with their local authorities in terms of prevention of these issues. But the national police is a problem. In Nigeria, Boko Haram girls that had been abducted by Boko Haram and then released, were then raped by the Nigerian army. Now, from the standpoint of the UK, are we partnering with the Nigerian army or the Ugandan forces or the various security forces around the world, especially in Commonwealth countries, in terms of training and so forth? If we are, these issues have to be central to that training. We know from studies by the UN that something like 57% of cases of people becoming radicalized into violent extremism is because of violence that was perpetrated against them by the police and security forces of their country. Right? This is something, these are the connections that we have to make. We have to deal with the ecosystem problem in terms of on the security level. We have to, if we want to be ambitious, we don't need more legislation. We have 10 Security Council resolutions that talk about, especially around sexual violence. We have endless reams of rhetoric around these issues. We have the ICC, we have all the, you name it, legally we have it on paper. We just don't have the implementation. And the implementation requires care for victims. We need a cadre of people who can provide and be trained up to deal with mental health care and physical care of victims. I was in Nepal in 2008, 2009, just after the war. 75% of women who came for health care to UNFPA, just for basic health care, had been victims of some form of violence, right? So it's really about frontline services, and it deals with us in terms of our development aid, humanitarian aid, peace and security assistance, and so forth. And I would end with this, that we need to close the loop and make sure that we're not enabling, we're not contributing to the factors that enable these crimes. So going back to the question of Afghanistan, we as the UK are the penholders on the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the UN Security Council. We have national action plans that say women should be at the peace table. We have national action plans that say when it comes to humanitarian response, we should have gender responsiveness. We didn't do it. We didn't bring out Afghan women who were at risk. My organization, we've been helping something like 2,000 people get out of the country, mostly women in the police force. We encouraged them to join the police force, but when the time came, we left them behind. That's what the world is seeing right now. So we need to close the loop and be incredibly supportive and protective of those that are at risk, at the same time as not putting more people at risk. And finally, as I said, making sure that in the security assistance we give, or in the healthcare, or in the development assistance that we are providing, we are really being robust about saying, in the next 5 years, we want 10,000 people trained in mental health care and psychosocial support for victims of violence and rape in various countries. It's doable. They're there. It's just a question of reframing and thinking about justice, not just as criminal justice, but as social justice. Because these people can't wait for prosecution. And as I said, prosecution doesn't necessarily come. And finally, I agree we need to increase, give a more robust international justice system, but we also need to learn from what happened with the International Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia. In the case of Rwanda, for 15 years, internationally, we spent $100 million a year on those tribunals. At the end, we had fewer than 100 prosecutions. We had people who had raped women, impregnated them deliberately as part of genocide, sitting in Tanzania getting their antiretroviral drugs because they had HIV/AIDS. So they were getting the medicine based on our international human rights norms, but their victims were dying of AIDS. So we need to look and see, where are we spending the money? How are we spending the money? What does it make? And what is the value that we get out of it? And I think that it's probably one of the best investments that we can possibly make to try, in terms of the prevention, in terms of the care, and in terms of the ecosystem of organizations and entities that provide these kinds of support. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam. A very stark and passionate contribution there. I'm interested. I mean, it's a very sort of bleak picture, but is there any country that's done quite well at providing that treatment to victims and to try and mitigate the violence against them in the first place? Have you seen a country that's done it quite well in terms of those things, or not? There's still a long way to go.
Short answer is no. Long answer is that what we see is that it is often civil society organizations on the ground who are running to the problem and literally taking on the responsibility to protect. So in Nigeria, we have colleagues that are trained therapists, and this is the service that they provide. We actually connected them with our Syrian and Iraqi colleagues to say, how do you, when you're on the ground and you see rape victims in Syria, and you were doing humanitarian aid, and now you have rape victims or victims of torture coming to you, how do you cope? We've been providing what we call emergency first aid versions of mental and psychosocial healthcare training for the first responders. But it's very much in the realm of civil society. It's definitely not in the realm of governments. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, and I'm sorry if I sound negative, is that since 2008 we've had a number of Security Council resolutions that call for prevention of sexual violence. We have a special representative on the issue of prevention of sexual violence. There's a lot of talk. They haven't come up with systems. We haven't tasked the UN and said, where is the healthcare support? Where is the security support? Where is, we haven't done that. We haven't even prosecuted effectively where the UN peacekeepers themselves get involved in sexual abuse and exploitation. These are things that we as the UK can do. We're a permanent member of the Security Council. We're the pen holder on these things. So holding our own institutions accountable and demanding that they are serving the people on the ground, not just having good conversations, I think is really important.
Thank you. Okay, Laura.
Thanks. I'll build on what you were saying, actually. Sanam, the International Rescue Committee works in 40 different countries worldwide with people affected by conflict and crisis, and we have a particular focus on women and girls. And I think it's really important to focus on women and girls in this discussion, because ultimately if we can't protect those women and girls who are often the most vulnerable and the most affected by these conflict situations, then really who can we protect? So I think we have to start there with the most vulnerable people and build out our thinking from there. We've heard about rape being used as a weapon of war. We've of course seen and heard a lot about that in the context of the Ukraine crisis. That's growing as a tactic. The statistics are horrific, but what we've found through our own research as well is that when you talk to women and girls who are affected by violence, what they report is not just a rise in rape as a tactic during war, but also a rise in intimate partner violence, in violence from partners, also from family members. And we're seeing that as there is a sort of normalisation of violence and the sort of unsettling effects of living through a conflict situation, that those other forms of violence against women and girls are on the rise as well. So I think listening to the survivors, listening to the communities affected, and thinking very broadly about the different ways in which we see violence come through and responding accordingly is very important. What we hear and what we've heard in the research that we've done from particularly from refugees, but from others who are also caught up in these conflict situations, is that there are some really significant barriers to justice for them. And a big one of those is the fact that national legislation isn't in place, local accountability mechanisms aren't in place, so the legislation isn't there, or the way in which it's interpreted doesn't help them achieve justice. And equally, or the court systems just may not be operating because of the conflict situation. I was struck by what Sanam was saying about the lack of access to social services, to healthcare services for survivors of violence. We certainly hear that a lot from the communities that we work with. And I think there are real fears still of repercussions for reporting. So if people do experience it, they don't know where to turn, but they're also afraid to raise the issue because they don't feel like they can do that safely. So there are lots of challenges there. And I think another really important point to bring out is that really, if we're talking about responding to violence against women and girls, in a sense, it's already too late. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done still on the prevention side. So before we're getting into these discussions, even about what we do when violence occurs, the question we need to be asking is, what more can we do to prevent it happening in the first place? And there is a lot of work that certainly that the humanitarian aid agencies do, with a lot of support from the Foreign Office, to ensure that when we're thinking about the programmes we run, that we're thinking about that from a sort of gender equality point of view. And there's a growing evidence base to suggest that if you can be thinking about social norms, attitudes, how you can shape them through your programmes, how you can work with local women's organisations to empower them, to let them lead the aid response in a particular conflict and crisis situation, then your response will not only be more effective in terms of helping the people affected, but also contribute to this longer term shift that we want to see in terms of empowering women and girls and therefore giving them a greater chance of finding justice when it comes to that. I do want to call out the Foreign Office, the FCDO, the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative Summit is happening in November. It's a fantastic thing that Liz Truss, when she was Foreign Secretary, really championed and started to drive forward. We do think that it will be very important that is not just a talking shop, but a conference that does lead to some outcomes ultimately for the people that we're talking about, and that Sanam also talked about, those who are ultimately having to live with these such severe risks of violence in conflict situations. And we really hope that as part of that summit there will be this consultation with the local women's organisations and with others affected, that will be thinking bottom up in terms of testing what solutions will work for them, and seeing how we can build up and support those. And of course, funding is a really important part of it. So tricky to be making the case for that at this point, but unless there is the right investments, the smart investments in those locally driven people and solutions, then we won't make the progress that we want to see. Nadia Murad, who is a survivor of sexual violence, has talked about how we don't need any more speeches, we need justice, and I think that's the spirit in which we hope the government will enter into the summit in November, and we look forward to seeing where that gets to. I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thank you, Laura. Okay, let's take questions and contributions from the floor. So a reminder, if you could say who you are, where you're from, and please wait for the microphone to come to you. Someone will be coming around with a microphone, and we need to do that, not because we won't hear you, but because the live stream need to be able to hear that. And just a reminder for people watching on the live stream, you can ask questions via Slido, or you can tweet us using the hashtag #BrightBlue. Okay, let's take a round of questions. So this gentleman here just stood up. Yes, you.
Thank you so much. It's Professor Azim Ibrahim from the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. When it comes to atrocity crimes, there seems to be a overemphasis on the tribunals and the punishment, whereas the purpose of the Genocide Convention of 1948 is to prevent and punish the genocide. The prevention always comes first when the serious risk of genocide threshold has been reached. And unfortunately, countries are overemphasizing the tribunals and the punishment aspect simply because it absolves them from their responsibility of suspending the relationships that they have with Russia. The convention clearly states that when the threshold of serious risk of genocide has been reached, as is the case in Ukraine and elsewhere, countries have to do everything within their power, politically, economically, diplomatically, to put pressure on Russia. Countries are keen to keep their options open, so they don't want to suspend gas purchases, repairing turbines, or diplomatic relationships, whereas this essentially invalidates the entire purpose of the Genocide Convention, which is to prevent the duty to prevent.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the importance of prevention there. Let's go to this lady here.
Hello, good afternoon. My name's Donna Gavin. I'm from Stroud. I also served in the British Army for 12 years. And my question is, Alicia, I'm fascinated to hear more about your point about gathering or investing in gathering more evidence, because the one thing we know is it's very hard to prosecute or indeed understand the roots of some of these problems without documentation and data. And we know that one of the challenges in this space, when under a conflict situation, we lose all those structures that are there to gather some of that data, but we also know the sensitivities around shame and reporting when a crime has occurred are all problematic. So I'd be interested to know more about how you can see that, presenting itself, and whether it's about putting pressure on the UN to do that, whether it's something we want to lead on.
Great, thank you. And then we've got a question here, the gentleman right at the front.
Thank you very much. Keith Best. I'm a former MP, but for many years I was chair of the World Federalist Movement at the time when we created the Coalition for the International Criminal Court of 2,500 NGOs worldwide, without which many international lawyers have been kind enough to say we would not still now have an ICC. Now, the ICC has been very inventive about the way it can get around jurisdictional issues, such as with the Rohingya. But one of the major sources of referral is now, in effect, nugatory, and that is, of course, the Security Council. We've seen a number of non-aligned states like Mexico trying to put pressure on the P5 to actually overcome the threatened use of the veto. Britain, in fairness to the UK, have been actually quite active in that. But I'd be interested to know what further action FCDO can do, particularly within the Security Council as a member of the P5, to try to actually overcome this hiatus where there are issues in the world which could be referred to the ICC by the Security Council, but frankly is just no longer available.
Thank you. Great. Alicia, maybe I'll come to you first for all or any of those questions.
So I think on the point about prevent, I agree entirely. You know, I open by saying the reason we do this is to, you know, to prevent and deter, to heal and to rebuild, but also for justice. And the amount of victims I've sat down with, victims of Daesh, victims of Assad, victims in Lebanon, victims in the Balkans, who want that day in court, who want to face down that person, though, and they want it to be seen on the world stage because of the destruction they cause and the harm they cause. I've been in Bosnia when I've seen funerals take place, and people always talk again about wanting justice. So I agree with you entirely, and that is where we have failed to put atrocity prevention as a key arm of our foreign policy. And I think I am one of those people who argues we have to be slightly braver when it comes to our foreign policy. We can't be everywhere. We can't solve every single problem. We need to work with our allies to work out where we can be most effective. But security and justice is a uniquely British skill set. We are incredibly effective at it, and we should be doing more of it. And atrocity prevention is at the heart of that. You can't have one without the other. So I do agree with you entirely with that. And on the documentation point, I mean, look at MH17. We all know exactly who shot down that aircraft. We know it was Russia. I remember being sat in the MOD on the day it happened. And even then, although we suspected, it isn't, the British government couldn't go out there and necessarily shout it from the rooftops. And it's thanks to Bellingcat and organisations like that, it's thanks to CSER, it's thanks to individual groups. We can document, but I think the problem is that, again, we shouldn't be relying on individuals who are experts at open source analysis to be doing this for us. And that is why we need to have an open source justice intelligence cell within the Foreign Office that works across all departments. It could be in the Cabinet Office, but I think Foreign Office would be better. And their job should be to pull together, as we did with the Global Coalition against Daesh, if we have something we are all facing, whether it's Ethiopia currently, another crisis no one seems to want to talk about, whether it's Ethiopia or Yemen or Ukraine, allied countries should be coming together and they should be putting together a cell that is resourced across all our different alliances, and they should be sat pulling together this evidence ready for a prosecution, and the government should be saying, yes, we are paying for expert barristers to come in and sit within that cell to make sure we're meeting the legal requirement. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, we should be smuggling people in and out of these conflict zones in order to train them on how to do it, because it is best when it is not outsiders coming in, but people within the communities who truly understand the nuances, the subtleties, and who can understand linguistically when someone is saying that a crime's been perpetrated against them, but not necessarily in a way that you or I might understand as an outsider going into that.
Okay, Sanam.
I want to come back to the prevention question as well, and this is why I said at the beginning on the question of Afghanistan and the fact that if Afghan women had been present as independent delegations at the peace talks, how many in this room think that the Taliban would have been able to get away with everything that they're getting away with? It's obvious, right? Why did we collectively stonewall them out of those discussions and current discussions, by the way? Current discussions. It's the same with Yemen. It's the same with Syria. It's a repeat.
We had a whole track 2 just women negotiations at the UN peace talks.
I understand. I've been involved in those. Yeah. What I'm saying is, I'm not talking about track 2. I'm talking about when you have these wars where you have a government killing its people and you have opposition forces that are also killing the people, you need people in the negotiations who are taking on that responsibility to protect. We know overwhelmingly it's women on the ground who are doing that. We're saying don't have them as a sideshow and a side circus. Put them as delegations, independent delegations, in the talks, eye to eye with the guys that are killing, that are perpetrating those crimes. That's number one on the diplomacy side. And let's look at what was the failure. How did we end up with the Afghanistan process? Because we're going to do it again. We're going to do it again. What happened with Ukraine? I'm not saying that we could have stopped Putin doing what he did, but where was the diplomacy? How much robust diplomacy was there to try and prevent it going back to 2014, 2015? These are some of the, if we're serious about preventing war crimes, part of it has to be, we have to be serious about preventing wars and stopping wars. It's a logic that we're kind of missing in all of this. So that I think is one thing. If we're thinking about shifting the shame and shifting the fear, shame is a very deeply cultural thing. How you feel ashamed in Iraq may be very different to how you feel shame in DRC, right? We need to work with local communities to understand what is it that gives the men the green light to say they can rape and it's okay, and what is it that will pull them back. We've worked with imams and community leaders in Afghanistan where they have changed their attitudes because of some of the trainings that they've had at that local level. So you need the local voices and folks that are on the ground. And then one thing that I want to talk about around these issues is that in 2008, I tried to get language on men and boys as victims of sexual violence in conflict into the Security Council resolution. It got crossed out by Libya at the time because we were told men and boys aren't raped. Of course, that's not true. It is a silent crime. It is an even more silent and more taboo crime that goes on. And one of the challenges that we have now is in countries like Uganda, where evangelical forces have gone in and changed the law so that homosexuality is deemed to be illegal. If you're raped as a man, you can't even go to the police because then you get accused of homosexuality, right? So again, thinking about connecting the dots and working with countries where we have leverage or allies and so forth, I think is really important. And the last thing I want to say is sanctions. We keep thinking sanctions is the way to go. The sanctions that we've put on Iran in the last 15, 20 years has meant that countless young men have had to get the bread on the table from wielding the baton in their hands. Right? It also means that we don't have leverage in a lot of countries. So thinking through the elements of how you do diplomacy, where we have leverage, where we have development aid, how we work with local communities. The system is all there. We all exist on the ground. We give grants to local organizations and so forth. We work with the Foreign Office. But the dots aren't connected holistically to actually shift and have a transformative step forward, and at least in the last 25 years that I've been in this space. Thank you.
Maxim, anything you wanted to come back on?
Yeah, I just think it's important to distinguish between targeted sanctions, which list individuals and entities and go after specific things, as opposed to sectoral sanctions, which can affect entire areas of the economy indiscriminately. And I think what's been happening in the Ukraine conflict is there have been a lot of targeted sanctions, which are, I think, generally good things. They're looking to establish responsibility and accountability, but they're not being policed effectively. I think the responsibility to prevent is very real. It's very there, and it's often ignored. And it's been ignored for the last 8 years in Ukraine. All the signs were there that this conflict was not going to end anytime soon, and that there were, Putin hadn't realised his territorial ambitions in Ukraine, and there was going to come a time when he would try to. And the world has deliberately can only be deliberately turned a blind eye to that, and we've continued doing business with Russia. And we continue doing business with many unsavory regimes around the world. And we really need to think about, the cash today is going to cost us tomorrow. We can see the damage that the war is doing to our economy now and the damage it's doing to our security now. We need to think more long-term about these relationships and avoid getting sucked into them in the future.
Just pick up on this point about the Security Council being ineffective, which I think is crucial and certainly challenging. The answer to that for me is twofold. And I think the first part is about finding those international bodies where there is still some potential. So we're calling on the UN General Assembly, for example, to set up a monitoring mechanism for humanitarian access in Ukraine, which is something that we're increasingly worried about, and it's within their power to do that. So I think, yes, the Security Council may not be the answer, but there are other mechanisms. And I think the second part then is to couple that with the really powerful local evidence gathering, investing in those organisations that are documenting what's happening and producing that evidence, the kind of evidence that Alicia talked about that led to the prosecutions of the Syrians through the German court system. so I think that's where we have to keep pushing as where we can internationally, but building up from the local evidence, because without that local evidence, we're not going to get the global accountability either.
Great, thank you. Let's have another round of contributions. Wow, gosh. Right, if you could be quite pithy, that would be good. So let's start with this gentleman here. Just yeah. I didn't mean that one, but it's fine. We'll go to the chat afterwards. Sorry.
I'll be very quick. I'm James Walton-Jones from the charity Spotlight on Corruption. So quite a few mentions of sanctions. What do the panellists think of the increasing use of the Magnitsky human rights and corruption sanctions to as a part of holding accountable those who commit war crimes? Thank you.
Okay. Second, gentleman just behind.
Thanks. Thank you. My name's Rocco. I work for War Child, and the particular dimension of atrocities that we focus on are those committed against children in conflict. They are specified by the UN: the recruitment and use of children, the killing and maiming of children, sexual violence. And a particular group that's completely marginalised from any kind of justice or recognition of their rights are those women and children who are accused of associating with terrorist groups or who have associated with terrorist groups. 60,000 women and children in northern Syria, tens of thousands of children processed through Nigerian prisons. Sanam, you mentioned girls who are doubly victimised. So to your point on the leverage the British government can use to work with those governments, those armed forces that it works with, and also to resolve the problems like that in northern Syria of a stateless group of people who no one really wants to take responsibility for. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's go to this gentleman here.
Troy from the Bridgend Normal Conservatives. With DFID being merged and the foreign aid budget cut, I think there's a very real danger that the British government's focus on humanitarianism might not be as consistent as previously. Would it not be better to ring-fence a budget for international justice and atrocities prevention, including funding for the International Criminal Court, meaning that Britain's shift from multilateral aid to bilateral aid does not compromise that particularly important institution?
Okay, thank you. And then the lady just in front.
Thank you. County Councillor Fiona Guest from Hemel Hempstead. My father-in-law was a Holocaust survivor. After the Holocaust, it was said, never again. But Rwanda happened, Bosnia happened, Ukraine is happening. So what lessons are being learned from the past to help prevent atrocities happening in the future?
Thank you. Great. Okay, I'm going to come to the panel with some of those, and then we'll have another round. Sanam, I don't know if there's anything that you want to pick up on.
Yes. On the sanctions question, one of the challenges that we have right now is that these sanctions become blanket, right? So when we have banking sanctions again on Syria or on Iran or Afghanistan, it is ordinary people that are first to feel the harm. I actually think that we need to have much more sophisticated sanctions that not only target the individuals that are perpetrating or implicated, but their relatives, right? And I may be going against human rights norms here, but I don't understand why it's okay to have somebody who is the Taliban, who's sitting in Afghanistan and not letting girls go to school, but their own daughters are going to school in Doha or wherever it is, right? So they have to. I mean, if sanctions are meant to prevent or pressure, it should be on the people and those that are their constituency and they care about, right? Not just on the mass of the public. So I think that there's something to be said about that. In terms of the stateless and the folks that you're talking about, it's not just statelessness; it's namelessness. It's identityless. So, in somewhere like Iraq, through the Saddam years and then later, they basically, one of the things that happened was that they removed civil code and allowed people to marry their children off, and often it's young girls, because when people are poor, they hand over their girls because they think they'll be protected somehow, to be married off to older men in traditional ceremonies. So the girls get married off to somebody much older, they end up getting pregnant, the marriage is not recorded because it's not civil law. When the children are born, because the parents don't have a marriage certificates that's known by law, they can't get birth certificates for their children. They can't get birth certificates, which means that they can't go to school because you need a birth certificate to go to school, right? So we have thousands, hundreds of thousands, we don't even know how many boys and girls across these countries that don't have official identities. What happens to these folks? What do you think happens to them? They are ripe for recruitment into militias, into radical groups, into sexual exploitation, into this human trafficking norm that is out there. And so this is another part of it that needs to be looked at. It's just get everybody documented, allow them to come into the system and be part of education, and let's fund those types of initiatives. It's much cheaper, it's much more effective, and in the long term, it is much more beneficial for us here if we're worried about issues around immigration and asylum and so forth. So that's another aspect. And then finally, on the question of asylum, we need to be fair, right? We need to be fair. If we're saying we care about and protect, and I have a quote from Minister Cleverly at the Security Council 2 years ago saying that we pledge protection for women and girls. If we're going to do it, then let's do it seriously. We shouldn't have Afghan women and girls or Iranian women and girls right now petrified about what's going to happen to them, if they're going to be deported or if they're going to be allowed into this country. Of all the people in the list of 2,000 people that I've tried to help in the last year and a half, the majority of the people we've been able to get through are to Germany. We had 559 families, majority women-led families. 2 families got to the UK. Overwhelmingly, the rest are going into Germany because we're reneging on our own commitments. I'm a British citizen. I came here as a refugee. I was 11 years old when I came from Iran in 1979, and my mother had to take political asylum. I was educated here. I'm incredibly proud of everything that this country's done and what we've done together, but we need to keep that legacy alive as well. Thank you.
Maxim.
So yeah, Magnitsky sanctions and the Magnitsky-style sanctions in the UK, they're good, and they allow the government to actually, they can target family members and associates. The difficulty is that there are not enough people involved in that investigative process to always easily ascertain who is an associate, who is a family member, and the resourcing is not there. There's a big problem with sanctions in that it allows us to feel like we've done something and we've changed something, we're taking action, and not look at the system which has enabled all of this illicit finance to amass, great wealth, to put, oligarchs' children through schools, to buy enormous properties in London. We need to be looking at that system in tandem with taking action against individuals' wealth. We need to be looking at the city professionals who often are helping people to move their money around before sanctions come in, and to make use of offshore jurisdictions to hide money from the government. That whole system all needs to change, and sanctions is not going to do that.
Great. Laura, I didn't know if you wanted to come back, particularly on sort of girls who've been involved with terrorist organisations and stateless, the war child question.
Yeah, I'm not expert enough in that specifically, but to me it sort of reiterates this same point about the evidence gathering and the data collection. And I think once we've got those, once there's more and more of that, and there's the information and the evidence for the to be acted on, then I hope you would start to see some progress. The point I was going to pick up on is the question on the aid budget and the question around whether there needs to be something ring-fenced for justice. To me, it's less about ring-fencing some specific part of the budget and more about mainstreaming accountability and justice across all of our aid spending, because it does interlink so directly with other aspects of aid spending that are equally vital. And one thing we call for a lot is that 50% of the aid budget should go to fragile and conflict-affected states, and I think that is where we see these really at-risk cases and where we really see accountability challenged. So I think there's probably a geographic focus, but then thinking about accountability within that is so important. And if you look at Ukraine, for example, as we think about what aid to Ukraine is needed now, the Ukrainian Parliament has said it wants to ratify the Istanbul Convention, which means that certain standards to prevent violence against women and girls should be upheld, but they now need help turning that into national legislation and working with local groups across the country to help make that a reality. So as we're thinking about aid to Ukraine, let's factor that in. But I think very much it should be kind of front and centre of the thinking about where aid is best deployed.
Thank you, Laura. And Alicia, you might want to pick up on a lot of those questions, but particularly the last one on sort of lessons learned from the past.
Lessons haven't been learned. Enough lessons have not been learned. I'm not sure it is in the human condition to ever really understand. And we talked earlier about Ukraine and could we have stopped it? I spent a lot of time trying to understand this. Last September, so this time last year, the UK government and the US government went around our allies and said, Putin is going to invade. It is going to happen in the start of next year once we get through winter. He is going to go straight for Kyiv, but he's not going to be as capable as he thinks he is. They didn't know more than that, but that's what they expected. And I've spoken to European ambassadors and said, why didn't you believe us? Why didn't you listen? And the arguments were that Macron has such a great personal relationship with Putin that he would know if that was on the cusp of happening. The Germans said that that was not their intelligence assessment. And a lot of the other Europeans said it came back to the Iraq War. And that, for me, is gravely concerning. If we are making modern-day decisions about modern-day conflict, having already seen Syria, where we emboldened him, Putin is a gambler. We allowed him to gamble in Syria. We've allowed him to gamble in 2014. We've allowed him to gamble since. We seem to be making our decisions based on something that happened when I was a child. We need to fundamentally learn those lessons, because only then, if we understand why our allies aren't listening when they should be, or why we're not communicating in a way that works, then I understand that we declassified a decent amount of intelligence. That, for me, is the only way in which we start to actually meaningfully say never again, alongside incorporating atrocity prevention and accountability across all of our work in the Foreign Office. It does not happen sufficiently, also with the Ministry of Defence. On the aid cut, we need to get back to 0.7%. I don't think that's in question. I think everyone agrees that we should be doing that. We need to make sure our allies uphold it. I've been gravely concerned about the fact that no one's been talking about Pakistan and the enormous devastation that's been taking place there. There are lots of places where this government doesn't seem to want to talk about foreign policy, whether it's Ethiopia, whether it's Yemen, whether it's what's happening in Palestine. We need to make sure we actually have these conversations, we hold them to account. On sanctions, what's really good is that we are now doing human rights sanctions, and we are also finally looking at those who profit from corruption around those human rights abuses. But for me, I want to see more on those who profit from human rights abuses and profit from the corruption around those, because those are the enablers. Those are the people who are going to keep pushing for more atrocities to take place. And just on the relatives point, I do want to make a point that we do actually do sanctions against relatives. So Lavrov's daughter, Putin's mistress, Putin's mistress's daughter. It's not easy, and it is a really complicated one, because unlike America, whose sanctions regime is entirely different to ours, we have to be able to uphold ours within a court and make sure we meet the legals, whereas the Americans kind of go for it and then hope to deal with the legalities later. We do need to do more of that, because that is where they hide their wealth, as we all know. But it is a very sensitive one in terms of, there are people some oligarchs' children have spoken out against the war, for example, in Ukraine. Should we be targeting that child? That's, especially, there's a really difficult one to make, but we are trying to do it. But of course, that is one where we're going to have to balance it.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for a kind of final round of questions and thoughts, and there's lots of people. So let's start with this lady just here.
Thank you very much. Charlotte Kenyon, West Sussex County Councillor. Sanam, is this on?
Yes, it is.
Sanam, you absolutely read my mind when you said about less than 1% of rape cases reach prosecution in this country. Against that, Laura, you raised the issue of resources, as did the questioner over here, in terms of the reductions in the aid budget. And Alicia, you just raised that very interesting point about, we know all of this. So there's really good stuff being talked about around the panel. And what I want to ask the panel is dig in a bit. What can we do practically to get more focus on this and get on the front foot? We know what the right thing is, and we have a great history in this country, and we could be doing more. So I'd like to hear more from the panel about how they think we can actually action this.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. Let's have this gentleman just in front.
Hi, my name's Max Darby. I'm just a borough councillor, unlike these fancy county councillors. So my question is sort of actually along similar lines, which is news doesn't have the same impact that it used to. When we think about when, the Welsh journalist, I think it's Gareth Jones, published the first accounts of the Holodomor in the 1930s, it was news for almost a full month before it disappeared off the front pages. Now, we, as Alicia accurately pointed out, there are 101 places like Ethiopia, like Pakistan, where the government doesn't want to talk about. And with the world turning a blind eye to Ukraine from 2014 until very, very recently. What can we do to make sure that the publicity of this is as impactful as possible, because at the end of the day, the court of public opinion does tend to impact the policy that we make.
Okay, interesting question there on the impact of the media. Let's have this gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Navi Daskar. I am the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Muslim Forum, and I work as a Communications and Engagement Officer at the Scottish Parliament. It's a question for Alicia. I was really interested to hear what you said about the government essentially picking and choosing which issues they support around the world, and this is where credibility comes in for our partners and allies. And as you said, when they didn't listen about Ukraine, you can kind of understand where they're coming from. I mean, going back to the Iraq War, which was many years ago, and under Tony Blair's government, which, it's well documented what happened there. How do we get to a situation where we do put, as the United Kingdom, a well-respected country of the world, that we give equal rights to all the issues around the world, all the wars, and all the sort of problems that occur, instead of saying we'll help those guys extremely, but we'll not even discuss that, or we'll not even mention the name of that country and totally wipe it off that it's not even existing. And this is where difficulty lies, of trying to get partners to support us. So that's my question.
Thank you. And then this gentleman here, just behind.
Yes, Councillor Jonathan Pratt, Bridgend. We talk a lot about the wrongs of abroad, but I'm just wondering the panel's view on when we get things wrong at home in conflict, and how we hold ourselves to a higher standard. So when our enemies see that we are prosecuting our servicemen for war crimes, on when they conduct them in service, that, well, if they're doing it to their own servicemen, what are they going to do to ours? I'd just be interested in the views of the panel there.
Great. And then finally, this gentleman right at the back who stood up.
I'm Matthew Vickers. I'm with a charity called Human Rights at Sea. The particular area of war crimes at sea that is a space that we could lead on very naturally as the UK. So we've seen this with Ukraine, some of the things in the Black Sea, because you can imagine crews of ships might come from many different countries. The sea tends to get forgotten about for everything anyway. But once you start looking at the effect on how you gather the evidence from different nationalities at sea, it's a really important area and a natural one given our maritime heritage that we could lead on.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for some very thoughtful questions and contributions there. I'm going to ask each panellist to give their sort of concluding remarks, taking into account some of the questions that have been asked. So I'll start with Maxim.
Okay, I'll take news as an easy one for me. I'm not sure about the premise that news doesn't have the same impact as it used to. I think news is working much faster than it used to, and it's moving in different directions. But you talked about having 1 month of coverage of Holodomor. That probably definitely wasn't enough, because you think about how many millions of people died, and now we've had 7 months of coverage of pretty front page coverage of the Ukraine war. It comes off the pages, but it goes back up. So I think that the difficulty really is news media is tending now to kind of try and keep up with what's happening on social media, and that we have our own views on what's important, and we put that in the newspaper, but also we're trying to cater for what our audience think are important, and if their views, things are changing because different things are coming in your algorithm, then it really it kind of skews people's attention spans. And so that's something that's going on, and it's been talked about a lot, and I think people are still wrestling, editors are still wrestling with how do we balance putting what journalists think is important on the agenda with what people are talking about in the street. I think what we've got wrong at home. I think I've talked a little bit about what we've got wrong at home, and I think actually it's important that the UK prosecute its own soldiers when they commit war crimes. I think that demonstrates what our values are and how important they are, and this especially in Ukraine, we're fighting we're helping Ukraine fight a war of values, and if we don't stand up for them at home, how can we expect others to take us seriously abroad? The question at sea, I didn't quite catch the thrust of it.
The what? Sorry, the
question about the sea.
Question about the
sea.
Who asked the question about the sea? Oh, sorry. Yes, Matt. Sorry. Yeah.
It's just about saying that human rights get thought about on land.
Oh, yeah.
Get forgotten about. War crimes happen at sea. Shouldn't we, as the UK, as a maritime nation, we're in a good place a natural place to lead on some of this about how you tackle it.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that.
Great, thank you. Sanam.
I'm going to, on the media piece, a couple of things. One is that there's always this assumption that if we know things, we'll act on them. But actually, that's not true. We have become completely exhausted and depressed by this kind of cycle of, and going back to your point, you know, it's the Uyghurs. I mean, we haven't prevented genocides. They keep happening. So there is, I think there's a public exhaustion that comes with this. And I wonder whether there's actually now the need for the media to work with those of us and organizations that are at the front lines of trying to find responses to tell the stories of what works, right? When you suddenly see, okay, there's this big problem, but somebody is working on it and somebody has good results, that I think generates a different set of emotions. And yet the media has never been, sorry to say this, the media has never been interested in what NGOs and others are doing or what's happening at the local level. It's kind of almost erased or belittled in some way. So I just wonder whether there's a question of shifting that. The second thing is going back to you know, what should be done. The devil is in all the details. But here are a couple of things that I would say. We have never had, as far as I know, a summit that governments have convened together with the major humanitarian agencies in the world, UN in other words, to say, give us your strategies and practice for the prevention of sexual violence in humanitarian and displacement settings. There's a lot of this that goes on in those settings. I've seen it, you know, I've been in camps in Erbil where I've been told young girls are being sold off for $200 and so forth. So where is the account, when we think about accountability, how have we held those agencies that get the money to do the humanitarian aid accountable for prevention of sexual violence strategies? They do hunger prevention, they do shelter and, you know, care prevention, but what about this? It's doable, right? So that's one thing. And then the second aspect of this is we have the PSVI, this Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative conference coming up. It's the second major global event that's happening in the last few years. If we just come out of this with words on paper, it's a total failure. What we need is to go into the meeting with some clear ideas and plans around, you know, whether it's what I'm saying around saying, how do we get people trained up in local communities, in fragile contexts, to be able to see the signs, do the prevention, do the mitigation, do the healthcare, etc. Whether it's about the humanitarian agencies, whatever aspects of it, we need money, but we also need the conference itself to be designed to put the impetus on this action moving forward. And I think it's a really important moment in time to be thinking about it in this holistic ecosystem, from the justice to the sea to whatever, because it is injustice, it is violence that is perpetuating more and more violence and the hate and the displacement and so forth that we're seeing in our societies. And there is such a thirst and such a need for dignity and justice. But our definitions of justice need to be expanded to this idea of social justice, livelihoods and healthcare and opportunities and so forth. And it's a time to revive that in the multilateral space as well as going back to the bilateral space. And I think there's no reason why nobody else is doing it. Why shouldn't we do that?
Great, thank you, Sanam. Laura, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I'll pick up on this point about getting on the front foot and also about the media, because I think the two are very connected. But I think we hear these incredibly brave survivors of sexual violence speak out. I think those stories are so important, those stories of how it affects people, how why it's so important that we have a greater focus on it are crucial. But the onus is really on us as aid agencies and on journalists and on anyone sort of raising this kind of awareness, not just to look at those stories that highlight the awfulness of it, but also the solutions that can make a difference. And I think, you know, there's a brilliant programme in the Democratic Republic of Congo where faith leaders are working with communities to try and shift social norms and attitudes towards women, and there is some very strong evidence that that's leading to a reduction in violence against women and girls. Just to go back to the women and girls theme that I started on, it's those kind of that evidence that the interventions that we make can make a difference, that I think we need to be talking about, and that I think the public need to hear about. And if they trust that we can do some good, then they will support that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And Alicia, final comments.
So I think on the point about the sea, you're absolutely right. I spent 4 months in Lesbos pulling people out the water because you don't let people drown, regardless of your thoughts and otherwise in terms of why they're moving. And there is a big problem with that and a failure to prosecute when those are taking place at sea. Somalia pirates, there are all sorts of issues around there. On war crimes, I agree entirely with the rest of the panel. We have to prosecute them when our people do them, and we should be prosecuting international peacekeepers who do the same, as was raised earlier. A big problem is that a lot of countries with dubious human rights records think that if they staff the international peacekeeping organisations with lots of their people, it will somehow devoid them of being held to account. But unfortunately, their people are also not trained and commit appalling acts sometimes. On the picking and choosing, it's a really difficult one because we do have a moral duty, and this isn't, some people like to say, oh, Little Britain thinks it's so big in the world. We are a UN Security Council member, we are a P5 member, we have a real responsibility. We also have the capability to do so. But there will always be choices, and there will be tough ones, and foreign policy should not be there. When you become an MP, a lot of people think that foreign policy is a distraction for those with safer seats. It's not. And that's what we've seen over the last 2.5 years. Foreign policy is about keeping us safe, and that is the foremost duty of any government. But I am deeply concerned. We need to move, and I've just said the words deeply concerned. We need to move from the Foreign Office thinking that when war crimes take place, they say they're deeply concerned. Mm-hmm. And when a genocide takes place, they're gravely concerned. That is not enough. We need to see actual meaningfuls. On the point about aid being represented and heard, I just point out that a lot of the justice and accountability work is not aid, it's CSSF funded, and that is really important work. So not everything always falls within the aid budget that we want to see in terms of meaningful action, and we do now obviously have Vicky Ford as the cabinet member for aid at the table, which I think hopefully will be meaningful. And then finally, on the point about media, there is no such thing as just a borough councillor, Max, but I would say there is a real challenge around desensitisation. And the mass graves we've seen in Ukraine should have been on the front pages and they weren't. And I don't know about your views, but I would like to see journalists making the decisions about what's on the front pages, not social media. Not least as a Conservative, I know that Twitter is not in any way representative of my constituents, let alone the rest of the blooming world. We need to invest in independent media. People like Mosul, who revealed what was happening in Daesh-held territory. And because they're independent, because they're smaller, more people trust them. And we need to go back to what trust, and I want small independent organisations who are trusted, forcing us to have conversations at the kitchen table. Because actually, when you're doing psychological operations and you're trying to get someone to defect from an organisation or stop being radicalised, you need to think about who do they actually trust, who do they listen to, where are the conversations that shape them. And then finally, I touched on earlier about the democratisation of information. All of us in this room have a duty to be a voice for those who others seek to silence. And all of us in this room, in this day and age of politics, have the ability to force our representatives and our governments to care about these issues, to raise them and to push harder on to fight for them. So I would actually say it's really important that we all go out there and recognise the agency that we have as individuals, not me sat here as an MP with more influence, every single person, and to make sure that agency is used to fight for these sort of things, because if you don't share you care about them, then your politicians won't care and the governments won't care and we won't see change and we won't save lives.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, everyone. It was, I learned a lot there, and times very sort of candid and bleak, but at other times quite inspiring, particularly what Alicia was saying at the end. So, thank you to the International Rescue Committee for partnering with us on this event. And just to say that we're doing 33 fringe events here at the Conservative Party Conference, and we're not even halfway through. So do take a flyer, and the goodie bags are on your chairs. Please take those away with you, so we can see you around, mingling around with a bright blue bag. And if you're interested in knowing more about Bright Blue, maybe supporting our work, becoming a member, please do speak to our team, Max there at the back, and Joanna. And I think the final thing I need to say is a big thank you to all of you, to those on the live stream watching, but particularly to our speakers, if we could give them a round of applause. Yeah.